Hi, and welcome back to the shop. Today, I'm going to try to complete a video that I've been working on for a month or so. It turned out to be more difficult than I thought in preparing for this video. It's a comparison of the low angle jack planes to the higher angle, and it involves a lot of different levels. In some ways, it's just a comparison between the low angle bevel up blade with the higher angle bevel down blade, but it's also a comparison of the different varieties of the same planes. I don't claim to be an expert on any of them. This is more about my observations using them. I hope this video turns out to be worthwhile, and I'm glad you're here to watch it. We have a 60.5 Stanley block plane on your far left. You have a Veritas low angle number 1. So here's the Sargent 514, the Lee Nielsen, the Stanley 62, more modern version, the older 62 here, and here, just for comparison's sake, is the higher angle and bevel down number 5, and the 605 bedrock and another 605 bedrock. The bedding angle, which is the base that the iron is actually put in at. You'll see the 60.5 is a 12-degree bedding angle, and that means that the blade will be sitting at that low angle, whereas the number 1 Veritas is at a 15-degree bedding angle, so it's actually a little higher up than the 60.5. Coming across, this is also the 12-degree, very nice low bedding angle. Here, 12 degrees, 12 degrees, 12 degrees again. So these are all pretty much similar in that way. But there are distinctive differences, and we'll get into those as I get closer into each plane and show you the methods for aligning the blades and things like that. There are differences in the way that the front adjustable throat opens and closes, the different types of mechanisms for doing that. There are different woods, mahogany, cherry, rosewood, and so forth. And of course the change in angles. And you see that the length, this is 14, 14, 14, 14. And then this one here, which is the older type 6A of the number 5, is only 13.5 inches. So it's a ½ inch shorter than these other ones. And then the earlier 605, the same, is 13.5. And then later in the production of the 605s, they came up and added a ½ inch to bring it to 14. So these are both number 605 bedrocks, but of different periods, and the length changed. Other thing is that all the handles are a little different. Some you see are taller than others, and some are very short, and some have different shapes than the others. Some, the direction of push changes, and we'll talk about that. Some of them push down as you use them, and some seem to push more across. So that will make a difference to the feel of the planes. So this represents from here over, this represents the typical Bailey plane, and the frog is set at a 45-degree angle. Now, the bottom of the blade we're calling the bedding angle because that's where the bottom of the iron seats itself on the frog. So in the low angle, there is a 12-degree bevel or angle to the base. There is no frog in this case, but you can see that the iron, here's the thickness of it, the bottom of the iron is sitting at the 12-degree mark above the base of the plane, or the same thing as above your work. So in the low angle, 12 degree. In the higher angle, 45 degrees. Now, the angle pointer here is showing to the top of the iron as opposed to the bottom. In this case, it's the same, because it's a parallel iron. If you had a plane that had an iron that was tapered and it was thin at the top and thicker, that would change things about this equation. But most of the work here that we're doing, all of the irons are consistent thickness all the way up and down. So let's just say that there's the 45-degree bedding angle and cutting angle, and here is the 25-degree, and the top of the iron is also at 25 degrees. Now, here, the cutting angle is going to be the top of the iron that comes through and comes out at the point. That is the point that is going to touch the wood first and do the cutting. So it is this top line that will never change in a high angle plane unless you adjust the frog location. Either put a wedge underneath it or use a different type of frog with a different angle. You can't affect a change to this top cutting angle by changing the iron and how you sharpen it. However, on the low angle, you see the cutting angle is actually not the top of the iron here, but the top of the angle here. So that is your cutting angle. So there's the difference. Now, with a 12-degree bedding angle and a 25-degree bevel on the iron, you wind up by adding those two together with this top of the cutter at 37 degrees. With the high angle and the bevel down, you still wind up with the top of the cutter at 45 degrees. So 45 degrees to 37, there is a definite difference between this cutting angle and this cutting angle, and you can actually see this line compared to this line. This is a much steeper cut, and there's an 8-degree difference if we don't do any micro bevel on either one. So this is the 62, the older version. We'll start with the numbers here. It's got this logo back here on your advancement rod, and the logo here on the cap iron, and it's again the low angle and the V cutter. This was sent to me by someone who knew I didn't own one and knew I was going to do this video, so they sent this to me to use for the comparison. I hate to send it back, but I have to. But it's a good plane. It has some issues. This piece here isn't original. Somebody made it, and I'll show that to you. It's not as snug and tight as an adjustment as it should be. It's got a nice low knob on it, and there were some issues that I had to level this off. I had to put some shims underneath this plate of tape to get it nice and flush. But it's the lightest of all of the low angle jack planes at only 3 pounds 4 ounces. And again, the heaviest is 4 pounds 14 ounces. So that's substantial. That's quite a difference. And here we are. I want to show you that this has no lateral adjustment for the blade, so you have to tap it. And setting these up can be tricky, and I like to practice them on a straight grain board before I go to end grain to make sure they're getting an even cut across the bottom. I'll open this up in a second and show you the difference for the others, but you can see this is the end grain olive wood, and you can see that the shavings that it's getting are real, true shavings and not just powder. And the surface that it leaves is nice and flat, nice and smooth. It cuts very easily. That low angle really, really does well on this. So this is the older Stanley, and if I open it up here, you can see the lever cap is nickel plated, very nice. The iron is a V logo, still plenty of length on it. I did re-sharpen it to the 25 degrees. And here's the mechanism. Let me show you the blade again. The Lee Nielsen directly copied this, basically. It's got the grooves on the back, and it's got the forward momentum here, a little tab there for the blade to sit in and go forward and back, but no side adjustment. And this comes out. There's no need for it to now, but unscrews just like the Lee Nielsen. And you can see it has, instead of a bronze plate here, it has a nickel plated plate with a B casting mark on it. So that's fairly typical. Now this piece is what somebody made, and it's all right. They did a fairly good job of it, but it's not original to the plane, and it's a little thinner than it should be. But it does work. This part goes onto this little piece, this little tab, so it pivots, and then once you get it where it needs to be, you can restart your front knob in here, which gives you the clamping pressure to hold that down. I did go ahead and do a lot of testing of these on different woods. This is a piece of walnut, and it's not totally straight grain, but I'm going with the grain there. And you can see the fairly fine shavings that it gets, and it gives a nice smooth surface. The way the throat works is you open it up like this, and then this pivots, and that opens the throat. Now you can see, hopefully, you can see through the fruit, through the throat there. Yeah. So this Stanley is the oldest of all of the ones here, and I believe they're the ones that came up with this concept. There was a number 62 and a number 64. The number 64 did not have an adjustable throat. It was designed for doing tops of butcher blocks. Otherwise, it was pretty much the same, no adjustable throat. So here's the Sargent, and you can see this big gap here. I've really tightened down the throat very slight, to make it very small. And the reason is that I'm going to plane here the olive wood, and the olive wood is amazingly dense. And this is end grain. I've glued up these pieces of olive wood so they're all running in this direction. But olive wood is funny. It has sort of a direction of grain that goes everywhere. So there's no real pattern to it. It's squirrely. But you can see I got some good shavings there, even though I had to sort of pry my way through. Let's try just an even stroke. It's producing a nice shaving that's holding together fairly well, and this surface is very nice. Does a good job. I am having to apply a little bit of force to it, but I would expect that in such a dense wood. But I'm getting good shavings, and I'm getting a nice clean surface. Now, let me show you on the Sargent here. The way this one works is, you can see here, if I take this off, the system that this has is this piece here revolving back and forth this way, and this little tab is what's engaging with this on the blade, and this pivots. So when you put the blade on, you make sure that the blade is going into that little spot right there, and another thing is that this can only go in one way. You see, if I flip it over, it won't go in. It's tapered. So it'll only go in one direction, and it seats very nice, and it swivels very nice. So I'm going to back this off a little bit so I can get this in properly. The dot there kind of shows where to put it, and here is the Sargent logo in here, a bit worn down. 514, so you know it goes to this blade, to this plane. And I resharpened it, as I said, and it's just at a 25 degree with no micro bevel on it, and that does make a difference. There we go, nice and flat. And then I can advance it. So this pivots, and that adjusts your lateral on the blade. And it's a little different than the others, as you'll see. And then this is fairly typical. So that just goes there, and then that tightens down. And there it's giving me nice shaving. Now, the other part about the Sargent is this piece. And you see this screws off completely. And the bolt runs all the way through, and there's an insert in here that's threaded. Nice bead on the bottom of this. And then this piece is your cam, your offset cam there. But it's cast iron, and none of the others are the same as that. And so that controls how tight your throat is by loosening that and then pivoting this. That opens and closes your throat just by turning this. The throat does make a difference, particularly on these squirrely woods. To be able to tighten the throat is a big plus. So you get a finer shaving that way, and a little less chatter, and it seems to cut really well and give you an actual shaving. Sargent's interesting because they were a little later in the game to get this plane out. It's 14 inches long, has a 2-inch cutter, and it weighs 3 pounds, 14 ounces. So here is the Stanley 62, number 62, with a newer handle, the cherry handle, which I'm not terribly fond of, but and the different profile of the cheek here, and different kind of lever cap than the older one. And this is a little low and hard to get to the way they've designed this, but it's not terrible. It is the heaviest of all of the low-angle jack planes, weighing in at 4 pounds, 14 ounces. That's 6 more ounces heavier than the Lee Nielsen, and the Sargent is only 3 pounds, 14 ounces, and of course the original 62 is the lightest. It's made of this ductile iron, and it's very substantial. It does a good job. It gives nice shavings on the end grain. Now I have this lightly set, and this one does have the new style adjuster, like the Norris adjuster, that actually is a lateral adjuster at the same time as it is an advancement. And you can see the blade or iron doesn't come out very far because you don't have to tap it. It is the heaviest of the irons, and that is at 0.185, and 3/16 is 0.1875. So it is just a hair under the 3/16, but it's more than the Lee Nielsen. The shavings, you can see, are very nice. cherry knob and cherry handle. The cherry knob, unlike the older 62, you see there's no screw here. The older 62 still has a screw there, and this one, and the same thing with the Nielsen, it has a screw there going through too. So I'm going to open this up to show you. Basically, it has the bronze plate on the bottom, more like the Nielsen, rather than the older 62. And you can see this is a very heavy adjuster there, and rather than the pin coming up, this actually has the pin attached to it and sits in there, and that's what does the adjustment forward and back of the throat, the adjustable throat. So let me get this back on and we'll take this apart. This apart here. Here's your lever cap, and you see they've made a sort of a modern, futuristic kind of look to it. It's interesting. You have access to this all right, but not much access to this. So if you want to adjust this lower one, you have to really take this off and then adjust that up or down. The other thing is this is a very light sort of aluminum casting, I'm assuming it's aluminum. I don't like it. I don't like that it's so chintzy. It hasn't broken on me or anything. It hasn't caused any real issues, but I think I would prefer a real brass one, or, you know, or even cast iron. Now here's the blade, and you can see on the blade it has the A2 and the part number, and then 25 degrees etched into it so that you can you'll know exactly the angle of sharpening, and you can see I've done the 25 degrees. But it's also very thick iron. Very nice. Now the inside of this, as I talk about later in the video, you'll see this has that Norris style adjuster, whereas on the iron, this hole here, that's what this little piece goes into. But the problem with this is as you advance, it also can pivot on you. It's also not as snug as the Sargent, but so the Nielsen, turn around my little cheat sheet here, is a 62, number 62, basically copied from the Stanley, but it's made with a ductile iron, bronze and cherry. It's 2 inches wide, the blade, and 14 inches long, and it's bedded at a 12-degree angle. And the iron is substantially thicker than the Sargent or the older Stanley. But in reality, the Stanley iron on the newer one is actually a little bigger. This one is 0.175, which is just under 3/16, and the Stanley's is 0.187, which is a little over. This one has a flush screw here, different, and flat screws rather than round over on the toad or knob, and the adjustment is different in the than the Sargent. So now I haven't set this yet, so I'm just trying this out, and we'll see what kind of cut, but I think I probably have to make an adjustment for the olive wood. Let me take this cap iron off, is bronze. The iron, much thicker than that Sargent. Sharpened the same way as the Sargent. And you see it has no adjuster going across. It only goes forward and back, a depth. So in order to adjust the iron, you have to tap it. And the way this works is, you see back here, there's a groove in the blade, and that fits onto this, where the Sargent had that little clip. So once that's set, your adjustment laterally is by hand. Put your cap iron on, close it off, and these are all single irons. There's no chip breakers added to it. The adjustable throat works similar to the Stanley. There's a bronze plate here, and then this, by going arcing in there with that angle piece, that's what makes the throat open and close. Here's the open throat. Here's the piece that's going in there. Here's our blade right here. So this piece fits in very snugly. The machining is very, very tight in here, and pops in like that. This little dot here fits into here, and then your knob goes in. There we go. Now this should move fairly easily, and then you tighten that down, and that keeps it from moving. Now I'm getting more of a shaving type, and this is sharp enough to cut you, so got to be real careful. It's such a hard wood. And I have to say, with all of these low angles, it takes a bit of adjusting to get the shavings that you want, and then to maintain them. So it's kind of nice to, once they have been set, try not to mess with them. So I'm comparing the frogs, or the seatings, inside of all of these planes. This first one you see is the sort of an imitation Nars. This is a Sargent plane, and it's got a notch here, and that's what this piece that's added to the iron sits on. So that's your adjustment in, and then that allows also for the pivoting. On the next one, which is the Nielsen, there is no lateral adjuster, just this little groove here that seats itself into the back of the blade with that one piece. Then let's go to the Stanley version, the newer 62, and this again is closer to a real Nars adjuster with this button here, and that seats itself into this hole in the iron, and then that gives you a lateral adjustment. This is one of the ones I don't like, because as you're going in and out, it can change your lateral adjustment. So it's not my favorite of them. But once you're set, you're set. So, and then the older 62, you see, has no lateral adjustment, just this forward motion, and you can see here the little notches, and that goes into the back of the iron this way. So that gives you that movement in and out, but without a lateral adjustment. So those are the four primary differences in these planes, besides the Sargent having this arched part further forward. Here you can see how I have all of the rear portions of the soles in alignment with this board underneath them. So you can see the differences in them. And you notice in the front that they're not all the same length. So that's what I was describing before. The other thing, if you look down the arc, here are the flat-sided bedrocks, here are the round-sided bedrocks, the normal 605. But now as you go up, you notice that the older Stanley that's here, the arc to that sole is much more forward than the newer Stanley, and the newer Stanley has a definite different shape to it. And then the Nielsen is more like the original 62, but then you notice that on the Sargent, how much more forward that arch is, giving it more support at the mouth, perhaps. I'm not really sure why it is that way. And then here you can see some of the differences in the handles. If I do this angle here, hopefully you can see the shapes change abruptly as we go down the line. General softwood planing is a 45-degree angle, and it's called a common pitch. For hardwood planing, they suggest a 50-degree angle, which is called a York pitch. Figured wood's a 55-degree angle, and that's called middle pitch. And molding planes generally have a 60-degree angle, which is called a half pitch. So these are variances in different planes that you should consider. As well, consider there's a single bevel, a back bevel, and a micro bevel, which I'll explain in another drawing. The bottom is your piece of wood, and just the top line of it would represent the bottom of your plane. So in this case here, we have that low angle, bedding angle. The bed angle is that lower section, and that's where the plane sits. So there's the bed angle is 12 degrees. Now, with a 25-degree sharpness angle and that bevel on the iron with the bevel on the top, we wind up with a 37-degree cutting angle because it's this top piece that's going to cut first. It's going to intersect with the wood first. So that is the 37-degree cutting angle. You can adjust what that cutting angle is by the way you put a bevel on the iron. So here is again a 60-degree cutting angle achieved using the same 12-degree bedding angle as the bottom of the blade. Here's the piece of wood. But instead of doing the 25-degree sharpness angle or bevel, we put a 48-degree bevel on this blade here, much steeper. And you see what we're achieving there is a 60-degree cutting angle. So you can achieve a higher angle even though you have a low angle plane, because what this has on it is a micro bevel. And remember what I said about you have a single bevel, a back bevel, and a micro bevel. And what we're doing here is we're taking our blade, our iron here in this position, and we're putting on it a typical 25-degree bevel. That's this red line here. But then we're coming back with this blue line, and we're putting a micro bevel on this. So by adding a micro bevel to that, you see it turns that line up. So now where the blue line is, instead of the cutting angle being here, which would be the lower cutting angle, we've adjusted it and raised it up from 37 to 42 because we've added a micro bevel of 5 degrees to the iron. So that's what a micro bevel does, and it increases that angle. Now, when it does that, you're really approaching more the angle of cut of the higher, of the bevel down and higher frog. Common pitch is that 45-degree angle. What we have here is the wooden surface, and we have the typical iron on a Bailey plane, which has a bedded angle of 45 degrees. So right in here would be the frog. And the frog is at 45 degrees to the bottom of the plane, the sole, and to the woodwork that you're doing. So here's the iron bedded against that frog. Now, the bottom of that iron is at 45 degrees, and the cutting angle of it is at 45 degrees, the top of the iron. Now again, let me reiterate that if you're dealing with a tapered iron where the iron gets skinnier at the top, that changes things, and that would adjust these measurements. It has a 25-degree bevel, or what I call sharpness angle, and that's this bevel that's been sharpened onto the blade. It does not change the cutting angle of the iron. The iron, the part that meets the wood first, is that top piece there. So this is still a 25-degree bevel. This angle in here, the same as on the low angle, and bevel up. So that doesn't change a thing. But your cutting angle is at 45 degrees, where on the other it was at 37 degrees. So it's steeper. Then if you see here, in this part of the drawing, you'll see that we have a secondary or a back bevel put on the iron. So this iron is still drawn exactly as this one is, and it has the 25-degree bevel put on it. But we've added a secondary bevel right here on this iron. So now what we've done is we've adjusted the cutting angle up to 60 degrees, because remember it was at 45 degrees, but when you put the back bevel on it, you have effectively changed that cutting angle right there at that point. So the third one in this drawing here is using the micro bevel. This is the wood part here, and we have the cutting angle at 45 degrees here. But what we've added is underneath here, this blue line is the micro bevel. So what we've done is we've knocked off the bottom of this iron, right in here, taken this part off. And we did a 5-degree variance micro bevel. So what that does is it changes this from a 25-degree typical bevel to a 30-degree micro bevel, because what it's doing is it's widening this because we've cut off that tip. So this angle is now 30 degrees rather than it being the 25 degrees. So we've not changed the cutting angle, but what we have changed by adding that micro bevel is the degree in which this sharpness is, or the sharpness angle. When you add a micro bevel to the bevel up low angle iron, you're bringing that closer into the same angle or pitch that you have with the Bailey bevel down. There's still a small variance, but much less. So what I like to do, and what I've discovered through this process, is not put a micro bevel on my low angle bevel up planes, and thereby maintaining a larger difference between the bevel up and the bevel down planes. So after all my tests, sharpening, resharpening, getting all these planes set up and working, and then tearing them back down and changing them, all the tests with the walnut, the olive, the sapele, I've not come up with a clear end result to this experiment to say that the low angle or the high angle is better or worse, or that one plane is nicer to work with. I enjoy all of the planes. That being said, there are variances between all of them. The angles that I tried to describe in the drawings, I hope that helps you to realize in sharpening it that makes a difference. In these 605 and the number 5, they all work very well. They do handle differently. There is a different feel to them when you're working with them. There's the direction of push changes, the amount of pressure you need. On the end grain, by far, the low angle bevel up plane without a micro bevel seems to work really the best on the end grain. On squirrely grain, I found the higher angle and setting the blade back and taking little cuts made a big difference. So you have all these things that make differences. You have how deep a cut you make, how steep the angle is. What are the bevels, the micro bevel or the back bevel that you put on your iron? What is that going to make as far as the difference in your planing? How soft the wood is, how hard the wood is. Those all go into this whole equation as to which plane you're going to pick. So I can't sit here and say that the low angle is better than the high angle. I can't say that the Sargent is better than the Lee Nielsen or the Stanley or the original Stanley. Older Stanley is the lightest of all of the low angles, and in some ways It's very comfortable to use because it's that light. However, I find that it does not quite cut as well as the heavier Stanley. The same plane, the 62, but there's something about it that the weight of this is considerably different. I do not like their lever caps. These lightweight aluminum lever caps leave a lot to be desired. You can't get in here. They didn't put a slot in this screw, so you can't adjust it easily with a screwdriver. You have to take this off, adjust that a little bit, put this back on, and I think that's a waste of time. I think there needs to be a slot there, and that would make this a much better plane, and I'd like to see a heavier lever cap, like a brass one, like the Lee Nielsen. The Lee Nielsen, which is a copy of the original Stanley, is probably the most perfect of all the planes as far as the adjustments. The weight is a little lighter than the Stanley, but it cut does really well. The iron is a little thinner than the new Stanley, but it cuts just as well. The handle I like much better. It has this angle to it that gives you a downward pressure. And with this plane, it does not take a lot of force to get a good shaving. It's probably still my favorite of the low angle. But let me tell you about this Sargent this guy loaned me. And I'm really appreciative of it. It was really, in its day, probably the best of them. So the Sargent, the Lee Nielsen, the newer Stanley, all four of those, for that matter, are all really nice. These are in a different class. The number 5 and the 605, they're just a different plane. And they work differently, and they feel differently, and there's nothing wrong with them. And I think, honestly, before I had these low angles, I got along fine with the high angles. So I'm not going to say that the bevel up or the bevel down is better or worse. What I'm going to say is that you have to pick the angle that you need for the work that you're doing, the wood that you're working on, and one is not better than the other. And all of them, when they're tuned up nicely, when I started they were all very sharp. I'll probably have to resharpen some of them. But in the end, they're all good. And that, it's up to you. So play around and enjoy them. Don't be afraid to use any of them. I like them all. Sorry there's no one winner. Thanks for coming to the shop, and I'll talk to you guys soon.